Hi everybody! My name is Michelle the Bookworm, and in this week's video I'm going to be reviewing one of my favorite books that I read this year. This is actually going to be my first book review on this channel, and I'm really excited about it. So here it goes. So a little backstory. In the beginning of this year, I started a classic literature challenge. If you'd like to learn more about what that is, I left a link of the video in the description. But in the beginning of this year, I started a classic literature challenge where I made up a list and challenged myself to read as many classic literature novels as I could this year. So this book is one that I read in the beginning of the year, and I've been really excited to read it. But because of all the hype about it and what I heard about it, I haven't read it until now. And that book is The Fellowship of the Rings. It's the first book of the Lord of the Rings series. I know my copy's a little tattered. It's well loved. It was a gift from my brother. So I have all three novels, and I'm excited to share my opinion with you about the first book. So, I read The Fellowship of the Ring back in February, but I wrote a review for myself personally, but I didn't discover Booktube until this summer, so this is my first time getting to talk to an audience about it, aside from my unenthused friends. So, for those who don't know what The Lord of the Rings is, if you've been living under a rock for the past decade, or it just hasn't interested you, the overview of The Lord of the Rings is that, or The Fellowship of the Ring, is that it is a continuation of The Hobbit, which was J.R.R. Tolkien's story about this little hobbit named Bilbo who went off on an epic adventure and brought back a ring. Now, this story centers around Bilbo's ring, which he later gives to his nephew and heir, Frodo Baggins. So, The Lord of the Rings follows Frodo, who discovers that this ring is, if fallen into the wrong hands, will allow the evil Lord Sauron to basically take over Middle-earth. I gave this book a good rating. Its descriptive imagery just pulled me in. I absolutely loved it. I remember back in high school, some of my friends who had read it said that there was a bunch of boring descriptive imagery of plants and that Tolkien was way too interested in plants. It was one of my favorite parts of the book, was all the beautiful descriptive imagery. So in this review, I'm going to cover what I really, really liked about the book, and then I'm going to cover what I didn't really like about it, and at the very end, I will tell the rating that I ended up giving this book. So, what I really liked about this book is that it was a continuation of The Hobbit. It wasn't a sequel, because what I really like about The Hobbit is that it was a story that Tolkien told his children. It didn't start off as him writing. It started off as a story that he told his kids. So I feel that leaving The Hobbit as it is, as its own story, kind of preserves that sweet, that sweet story that he wrote for his kids, and then it allowed it to branch off into possibly being something more sinister. I liked how there were elements from The Hobbit in The Fellowship of the Ring. For instance, it did center around Bilbo's souvenir that he got from The Hobbit. And additionally, when they're going to Rivendell, you get to see snippets of Bilbo's adventures, particularly the trolls that were left. You get to see the trolls that were left out in daylight. And Frodo even remembers, hey, this is the path that Bilbo took on his adventure. And I think that that's kind of sweet. It shows that he's kind of following along in his uncle's footsteps, and it kind of touches on that sweetness of the first book, I think. Another reason why I like the fact that The Hobbit and The Fellowship of the Rings were separate was because it gave this trilogy room to grow and expand into the story that it was today. Being a children's book, you kind of had to have this air of plativity and that the hero will always come out okay. And you get that in The Fellowship, definitely, but there's also some more sinister aspects to it. Where it's a scary world out there. It's not just a world that you can go out and grab for an adventure. It is. But there's also some dangerous elements to it, and I think that freedom, that detachment allowed for that air of creativity. Another thing that I really, really liked about The Fellowship of the Ring was the lineage and the extreme depth that this story had for the lineage of all of its different characters. And that aspect, I feel like it kind of had a bit of a Beowulf feel to it. It showed, by telling who their ancestors were, it kind of also gave a little bit of a clue as to who the main characters were. For instance, Frodo was half Baggins, but he was also half Brandybuck. So the Baggins were notorious for doing nothing, basically, and that's what made Bilbo so great, was that he was the first Baggins to go out and have an adventure. So not only as a Baggins, he's notorious for he's extraordinary for doing unextraordinary things. And Bilbo broke that mold. As Bilbo's heir, it's questionable now. Is he going to still be a homebody? Or is he going to be like his uncle and break the mold and get that adventurous itch? We don't know. It is also interesting that he is half Brandybuck. Brandybuck? Yes, Brandybuck. Which is where Brandybucks were considered strange because they knew how to boat, even though it is well-known knowledge that, in general, hobbits don't know how to swim. Hobbits don't learn how to swim. They live in holes in the ground. They don't generally venture off, and they don't generally learn how to swim. And actually, Frodo's parents had died boating. So you would think that he would actually be terrified of boats. Honestly, I think that it's interesting now thinking about it, how that's not a trauma for him. What a strong lad. So another thing that I really liked about the story was Gandalf. So what interested me about Gandalf, and I'm a huge Harry Potter fan, so I do make a lot of parallels between Gandalf and Dumbledore. But what I found really interesting was that there was so much lineage with Frodo, with Merry and Pippin, with Gimli, that I found it really interesting that there isn't any lineage for Gandalf in a novel that is so ingrained with lore and how your family is supposed, and your family's name is supposed to define you. It is so interesting to me that Gandalf doesn't have a lineage. You don't get to know about his history, and in fact, a lot of them don't know where he is half the time. I personally find that very frustrating. But it does give room for him to be this mystical being higher than everyone else. So the second thing that I really, really liked about the Fellowship of the Rings. Second thing? No, yeah. So another thing that I really liked about The Lord of the Rings was all of the folklore that was ingrained and woven into the narrative. The hobbits were singing and they every once in a while they would just break out into song, whether it was a lament, whether it was an exciting bard. They were constantly singing. They were constantly singing about tales of old. So first I'd like to define what folklore, my definition of folklore. So folklore is the traditional beliefs, customs, and stories of community passed through the generations by word of mouth. So the fact that they were singing these stories, and these stories generally had a really deep message and pertained to what was happening. For instance, the tale of Lothlorien, the river, there was a huge message there. I can't, it just expressed the beauty of it and kind of this timelessness that this place had. Another thing that I found really interesting was the folklore behind all of the artifacts. For instance, the lady had given the company these cloaks and these brooches, and just that these were ancient artifacts endued and blessed by the lady kind of made them mystical and powerful. I don't know, I think it's really cool, and how there's the swords. Every once in a while they'll come across an ancient sword and would have this huge history, and it would bring the artifact to life. Another aspect that I really liked about the Fellowship of the Rings in terms of folklore in particular was the different cultures that these races had. For instance, I found it really interesting. It went into really big detail about the faux pas of the elves, and especially the hobbits. You know, you get to learn in the first few pages a lot about, you get a whole section on the ins and outs of the hobbits, which I think is really, really cool, particularly since you are supposed to be reading this story from Frodo's perspective, which I find really interesting because it allows the reader to kind of have this naive aspect in the world. You can ask a lot of questions, and through those questions that our poor naive narrator had, you can learn a lot about the folklore throughout the world, which I think was very intelligent on Tolkien's part. These culture differences also led to conflict, particularly famously between Legolas and Gimli, where there's this racial tension that is resided and inherited through the ages, back when they were fighting. And I think that this was a really important part, is that they actually became fast friends in Lothlorien, because they couldn't remember what each side was fighting about. And I think that that's kind of says something about their character, that once they get out of their own culture and kind of are able to take a step back and analyze some of the reasons that they do what they do, it kind of shows that, and like, meaningless fighting is not acceptable. It should not be acceptable. If you're going to fight, you should be fighting for something. And you should know what you're fighting for, in essence. And if you don't know what you're fighting for, then why are you fighting? I think that that's a really important lesson that we could learn in today's culture when it comes to religion, war, and other controversial arguments like that. Now I get to talk about, I think, probably my favorite aspect of this book, and some of you will probably disagree with me, but my favorite aspect of this book was actually the landscape. I absolutely loved it. I loved the descriptive imagery that Tolkien used in order to pull the reader in. For me, I need that descriptive imagery in order to be engrossed in this novel. If I'm reading a novel, I want to be there, especially if it's one about fantasy. If it's a fantasy novel, I want to be transported into that world, and Tolkien did this for me through his descriptive imagery. The descriptive landscapes not only worked to transport me into the novel, but it also helped to set the moods. For instance, the mood of Hobbiton is very hilly, very open, very breezy, and really easygoing. It's a beautiful, warm, welcoming place that's just kind of tucked in the hills. Now, when they start going into the forest, the old forest, you start to see elements of anxiety. And I really loved how Tolkien used the environment and nature around him to give them that element of anxiety. At this point, as they're entering the old forest, they know that they're being hunted by the ring wraiths, and they're scared. They are in this foreign land, and the trees kind of reflect that, particularly at this one point where they seem to be going willy-nilly, and they rest underneath this tree, the scene where they rest underneath the tree, and in the morning these tree roots are coming up and eating them. This is something that's they've never experienced before. They never experienced the wilderness trying to eat them. And I think that just added like an extra layer of anxiety and adventure, because you never know who's gonna come out and eat you. It could be a tree, it could be Sauron, you don't know. And that's, it kind of, that is ebbed away a little bit when they meet Tom Bombadil, which happens in this scene as well. But still, Tom Bombadil is explained as this wild man who is so slick and sly that he's kind of one with the forest. Like, the forest has kind of accepted him because he respects it. And I think that that's a really, really, really cool aspect, and I love how Tolkien just used the elements in the trees to just give that air and that tone to the novel. Though I absolutely love The Fellowship of the Rings, I did not come away from reading this book without some criticisms. I there were some things that I didn't particularly like about this novel. The biggest thing that I didn't like about The Fellowship of the Rings is that it is really confusing. It was just hard to keep track of the folklore. I feel like they would tell a story of the river and it would be foreshadowing a future event, or they would be singing a song in the bar and drinking, and there would be some type of warning to it. But there's so much of that, and there's so many songs and so many stories that it's really hard to think back on that and remember that for next time. For when the event does come, maybe that's just me, maybe there was no foreshadowing, I don't know, because there is so much of it that I didn't actually retain these stories. Maybe this will change if I go back over it, and if I really, really studied the novel. This is my first time going through it. I'm sure there's a lot that I missed, but that really made it confusing. I understand that there's also the Silmarillion that I could probably read. I just feel like there needs to be a whole nother book that explains all of this folklore. It could be a book in of itself. And I will definitely look for it and do some research after this, but I'd like to finish reading the series before I do that. The last criticism that I have for this book, and possibly one that I found most frustrating, was the lack of maps within this book. And maybe it's just my text. I mean, this is the text that I get, but the maps in this text are far from adequate. They are far from adequate. It is confusing. I'm supposed to be getting everything from these tiny, tiny little maps. It's not gonna happen. So I think that was one of the most frustrating parts of reading this book, is that every time they got someplace new, I found myself flipping through this giant book trying to figure out and find where they are so that I can keep track of where they are in their journey. And it did get a little bit frustrating, particularly at the time I did not have access to internet, so it's not like I could have really Googled the entire map, which I feel I kind of appreciate, because when this book first came out, nobody probably had access to a big giant map of it either. So it kind of gave me helped me to gain a clearer analysis of this book. For a book that is about traveling, I feel that the lack of adequate maps is a real downside. It just made it really confusing, and I found it at times I just put the book down because I felt confused and discouraged about where they were. The only way that we knew that we were off course was from Aragon half the time. It was a good, and maybe it was for like the journey. You're supposed to be there for the journey, not the destination. I really get that vibe from this book. But it would also be nice to know where they are. Also, the maps that were in this book were helpful, but they were not helpful enough. And the fact that this book even needs maps just kind of shows how convoluted it is. I love it to pieces, but it was a pretty confusing text. Now that I have told, and now that I've said my personal pros and cons that I had reading this book, I would like to go ahead and give this book a rating, and it is... I gave this book a 4 out of 5 stars, or an 8.5 out of 10. This is one of the highest rated books that I've done this year. I am pretty critical about the books that I've read. And even though I do have a lot of criticisms about this book, there's so much element that I love about it that it's already making me want to go back for more. And I'm looking forward to rereading it just to get that. It makes me thirsty to know more and to know more about this fandom, to delve right in, and I love that about a series. I love digging into a series and getting all that background and all of that folklore. I love it. This novel did become a little bit boring, partially because I noticed a pattern within the Fellowship of the Rings, and that pattern was travel, encounter, build, and progress. So this is the what I call the travel, encounter, build, and progress. So they would travel for a bit, have an encounter, get their butt saved, and then they would either build from that or they would just progress from that. And that was pretty repetitive. I understand that that is needed in order to elongate the story. Otherwise, it would just be a quick trip to Mordor. But it was kind of repetitive. And I got lost. The encounter started becoming less interesting after that. So those are my biggest critiques, but mainly, I absolutely love this book. I wish that I had read this in high school. I wish that there was still a fan base to talk to about it. I feel like I'm jumping on the bandwagon a little bit late, but it is what it is. So anyway, thank you for joining with me. My question is, what, because I like to end these videos off with a question. I think I'm going to start doing that. I didn't plan one, so I'm just going to think of one really quick. What element did you like best about the Fellowship of the Rings? If you've read the Fellowship of the Rings, what fantastical element did you like? For me personally, I like the landscape a lot. Is there something in particular that you liked? If you have any comments, feel free to leave a comment in the description below. Thank you so much for joining me, and I'll see you in the next video.